Okay. So what's a population? Anybody? Anybody have an answer for what's a population? Okay. What about you? What do you think a population is?
A group of individuals of the same species.
Okay. A group of individuals of the same species. Good. Anything else? Okay. That's a good one. Now, a population could be actually anything. We could have a population of, let's say, laptops, right? All the laptops that have been made, and we want to sample them and decide, are they all to specs and all that kind of stuff. But in biology, a population is a group of individuals of the same species who actually can interbreed. Now, sometimes populations from separate species can interbreed. We'll get to those later. Just so you know, though, you all have some Neanderthal in you. Everyone in this room has an inner Neanderthal. Okay? So when you kind of wig out, it's not you, it's Neanderthal. Remember, they're cavemen. They don't know any better. That's not true. But it's true. Modern humans and Neanderthals actually interbred on a number of different occasions. So a population is a group of individuals in the same species that actually breed and produce viable offspring. Now, if we actually look at this, okay. Okay. Here we go. What is going on? Here we go. Okay. God. Okay. This is a population of chickens. There's 3 different colors. There's, in this, anybody remember what an allele is? An allele. What do you remember? Anything about an allele? Nothing? Anybody? Okay. Yeah.
Variation in genes.
Exactly. The variant of a gene. Now, there can be thousands of alleles, different variants of the same gene. The thing is, everybody in here has 2 alleles. They have one from their mom and one from their pop. Okay? In this case, we'll say the alleles are A1 and A2, red and orange. Okay? Now, if you have a whole population that's capable of interbreeding, it means pretty much like you take all their alleles and you throw them into a big pot and you mix them up, and if it's a randomly breeding population, this is just as likely to get a blue one as an orange one. So the thing is, some of you, let's say with this A1, A2 allele, some of you have both alleles are the same. So if we actually look at this, we have 2 A1s, which means that an individual with 2 A1s is homozygous. They inherited one allele A1 from one parent and one allele A1 from another. Okay? And if you actually look at this, you see that there's also the same thing where both of them are A2. In other words, they inherited from mom an A2 and from pop an A2. However, there's also these individuals here that inherited an A1 from one parent and an A2 from the other. Okay, now, an individual, so we have all these alleles, but an individual always has two of them, and that is their genotype. Okay? So they've got alleles, A1 and A2, and you can either you have three genotypes that you can possibly have. You can have A1A1, A1A2, which is heterozygous, and A2A2. Okay? Individuals who are A1A1, in this case, their phenotype. Now, there's a genotype and a phenotype. We'll explain that in a second. Their phenotype is they're a blue chicken. Those that inherited two A2s, they're orange, that's their phenotype. And those that inherited one of each, they have a green phenotype. Okay? Now, you've probably heard about dominance and recessive traits. In this case, there's no dominance. It's pretty much it's what's called codominance. Okay? But you don't have to know that right now. So what we're interested in terms of this population is the frequency of the alleles in the whole population or in the whole gene pool. And then we also might be interested in the frequency of the genotypes of the individual organisms, in this case chickens. Now, so we have an allele as a variant of a gene. Alleles from a population thrown together, it's called a gene pool. And then we have the genotype, three genotypes. So when you have two allele model, you're always going to have three genotypes, but sometimes you'll only have two phenotypes. So let me explain. Salute. A phenotype, that's the anatomy, physiology, development, behavior, and environmental influences that go into being an individual. In this case, it's chickens. So environment can play a big role in terms of gene expression, but we won't worry about that right now. So a phenotype, though, is the whole deal. Selection actually works on the phenotype. Now, one misconception is that genes code for traits. They don't. They code for proteins. So you have an allele. In this case, we'll say an allele that gives color to these chickens. You say, well, that's a trait. No, that's a pigment. They code for a protein pigment that then, in fact, gives a trait. But there's a whole bunch of things where you can't actually see that sort of connection. So genes do not code for traits directly. They code for proteins that are then combined into ways that give certain traits to the phenotype of the individual. Okay. Now remember, all these lectures, I'm actually posting them, right? So you don't have to take detailed notes right now. You can go back and look at the lecture and make more detailed notes. The main thing is actually paying attention and then trying to understand this kind of stuff. So, are there any questions? Anybody? Okay. There probably are, but that's how it goes. Okay, so The essence of a process of evolution is that new alleles come into the population through mutation. In other words, you end up in a mutation where, let's say in a protein. So it's a protein, it's actually a mutation in the gene that then codes for a certain protein. So these mutations are constantly being formed. Most of them never make it into the population per se because they're bad. Just think about a protein has to work in the exact right way, and so most mutations will probably interrupt the function of the protein. And you'll get a protein that's non-functional or dysfunctional, okay? Or you're in a region that doesn't code for proteins, and then it doesn't have any effect at all. So, but anyway, these new variants come in. Let's say you have one that's somewhat beneficial. It comes into the population from one individual. If it's beneficial, it might spread in the population. In other words, those individuals who have a beneficial mutation are more likely to leave offspring that are going to leave more offspring. So in other words, a really beneficial mutation should spread through the whole population by selection, by natural selection. Okay? And then you have these old alleles, or the alleles that were already there. Some of them at one time might have been beneficial, but the environment changed. For example, let's say you have a bunch of wolves, right? Those kind of animals, right? And if you go farther north, you notice that their fur gets thicker and thicker. Now, if the climate were to change, like it's kind of doing right now, where having a really fur-thick coat would be, let's say, would be uncomfortable. Just think about a big down parka on a hot summer day wearing something like that. You wouldn't be very comfortable, would you? And you certainly wouldn't feel like having sex with a big parka on when you're really overheated and all that. You're going to get overheated anyway when you're having sex, right? And so, in terms of climate change, let's say it's getting warmer, individuals who have less dense or thinner fur are probably going to leave more offspring than individuals with thick, dense fur if the climate is getting warmer. Okay? That means the alleles that ended up controlling fur thickness, in other words, proteins that were controlling, that are part of fur, those individuals with thinner fur would probably survive better, they wouldn't get overheated, and they would leave more offspring. Okay? And so, on a variant, an allele that had, for let's say, you had a bunch of alleles for thick fur, those would probably disappear from the population. Okay? And because of this, we get this thing, alleles, these gene variants, they fluctuate inside a population. Now, there's other reasons for this fluctuation that we'll get to in terms of other forces of evolution, but for right now, we're just talking about evolution by natural selection. Okay. And if this is true, then you actually should be able to sample populations of individuals over time and see changes in allele frequencies if evolution by natural selection actually occurs. That's one of the predictions. So remember, in the scientific method, we come up with explanations. In this case, the theory of evolution, first proposed by Darwin and Wallace, makes very specific predictions. You then test that, and if those predictions are upheld, there's provisional support for the theory that we're, or the hypothesis that we're talking about. In the journal Nature, there's 3 papers that were published this week about looking at variation among human populations all over the planet, where they sampled many individuals from each population. Because each population has all these alleles, and not an individual has all these alleles. Remember, you're only getting 2. And they could be the same or different for each locus. And a locus is a gene area on a chromosome. Okay. Anyway, they were wondering, in fact, whether modern humans, anatomically modern humans, made it out of Africa and spread across Asia from one population that left Africa, or if there were multiple emigrations leaving Africa with different modern human populations. For the most part, it seems like all the people that are around today, including Eurasians, Europeans, Asians, the Americas, Australians, all came from one population that left Africa about between 40 and 80,000 years ago, and then eventually populated the rest of the planet. So these are the kinds of things you can do. Now, they did find in Papua New Guinea some alleles, only about 2%, from a modern human population, but it looked like it was pretty much a dead end for everybody else. Okay. So, I mentioned forces of evolution. We were talking about evolution by natural selection. That means we're talking about alleles that are deleterious, that means bad, or beneficial, good. And they don't have to be like, oh, beneficial, perfect, or deleterious, terrible. They can be on a scale. Okay. Well, it turns out that aside from evolution by natural selection, there are other forces that will change allele frequencies in a population. One of them we've just talked about, which is mutation. Mutations, so there's our genetic code. Just so you know, you're going to be learning about this later. We have a genetic code with 4 letters, 4 bases. C, T, A, and G. Okay? There's 4 of them. You can go from, let's say you have a mutation where you have the letter T, and then because of some mistake, it's now changed to a letter A. That's a mutation. In terms of whether it's a beneficial or a bad mutation or has no effect at all, depends on where it is in the genome, the whole genome. That means we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And also, in terms of coding regions, where it occurs in the coding region. So the thing is, mutation by itself, mutations are rare. Of course, if you have enough individuals, you'll get a certain number of mutations. Mutations by themselves will change the frequency of a population, the alleles in a population, adding new alleles, right? But it does it very, very slowly, unless it's under the force of natural selection. And then bad mutations are quickly weeded out, and good mutations are become more common. Now, there's also something else that we'll learn about called genetic drift. This is kind of like a random event. It has no effect on being adaptive. In other words, whether it's good or bad. It happens randomly. You might say one example would be, let's say, a little butterfly. There's a pool of water. It's sitting there drinking some water. I'm walking along. I accidentally step on it, and it dies. Well, that butterfly probably has no traits that would prevent it from dying, or from that kind of encounter, because it doesn't happen very often. It was just the poor butterfly's dumb luck that I was there at the wrong time. That's an example of genetic drift. Now, that's not the main cause of genetic drift. It has to do with reproduction, which we'll get to later. And then there's also something called non-random mating. If it was random mating, it'd be like anybody in here could mate with anybody else and they'd want to, right? Because it's a big free-for-all. But usually, in many organisms, there's non-random mating where there's sexual reproduction. In other words, you're more likely to be attracted to someone kind of like yourself, or maybe you like novelty, and you're more likely to be attracted to someone who's got features that are completely different than yourself. Okay? Now, and then finally, there's something called migration. That means, let's say you have a population of those chickens, and one of the farmer who has them decides he's got a friend on the other side of the country who would like some of his chickens for breeding. He takes those chickens, he ships them across the country, and then there's the alleles that are in his chickens, the first farmers that are not in the second wants some of those new alleles, and so he breeds them. Now that's migration. That's going from one population of chickens to another population of chickens. Same thing happens with organisms. Leaving a population or coming into a population. So allele frequencies can change because of that as well. Okay. Now Darwin and Wallace, we'll say the first great idea that they came up with, if we remember correctly about evolutionary thought at the beginning of the class, there was this idea that special creation, that organisms were created perfectly, all that kind of stuff. Well, Darwin's first great idea is evolution by natural selection, which is different than natural selection alone, which we'll get to in a second. So in other words, individuals in a population that have alleles that are more beneficial than others will leave more offspring, and future populations will look more like those original ancestors than individuals in that original population who didn't leave any alleles, and those will go extinct. Okay, and then evolution by natural selection makes a whole bunch of predictions and also observations. So we get observations from all over the place, including geology, living organisms, genetics, all kinds of things. Okay, so Darwin's idea of natural selection. Now remember, Darwin, you've heard about income inequality. I'm sure everybody in here, right? Okay. Darwin was a member of the 1%. Income inequality back then was much worse than it is today. You were born into a class. If you were poor, you were usually born as a peasant, and the person that owned the land kind of owned you. Or you were born as a kind of a cheap worker who, let's say a miner, or someone who worked in a factory. Didn't matter whether you lived or died much, and you didn't make very much money. Okay. Darwin was rich. One of the things that the rich people back then did was they would play with breeding. They would breed all sorts of different things, just for fun. Also for usefulness, let's say. Okay, so this is called selective breeding. Anybody in here have a dog? Anybody have a purebred? Okay, what purebred is it?
German Shepherd.
Okay, what about you?
Golden Retriever.
Huh?
Golden Retriever.
Golden Retriever, okay. And then, anybody else have mutts? You know, dogs that have a mix. Okay. Well, back then, now, these original dog breeds, they're all from one ancestor that was actually a wolf, related to a wolf. But these purebreds were all bred for specific purposes. Like a terrier, these little terriers, rat terriers, were actually bred to hunt rats. Border collies were bred because, well, they're compulsive obsessive about hurting things, hurting other animals. They were bred for those traits. Okay? Golden retriever. They want you to throw shit all the time and go get it and bring it back. To them, that is like heaven. That's all you have to do. You go, you take something, you throw it, they come, they go and retrieve it and bring it back. And if anybody in here hunt? No hunters, okay. You're not bloodthirsty enough, that's the trouble. It's too bad. If you hunt, let's say ducks, you have a golden retriever because, well, you're hunting ducks. Ducks are water birds. You're sitting there freezing your ass off early in the morning in a duck blind. And you put out these decoys that look like ducks, but they're plastic. Ducks come in, they think, oh, there's my buddies. They all settle down. And you start shooting those ducks. And the ones that you hit, you don't want to go swimming after your own birds, but you've got a dog that's been bred to do it, right? That loves to do it. That's thinking, shoot as many of those damn birds as possible. I'll get them all, I promise. Okay? They were bred for that. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, another one. As you can imagine, there are a lot of animals were bred for besides dogs. There were cats. There were chickens. There were cows, which were from Arctic, these giant big bovines that were wild in the past. There were pigs. There were sheep. One of the big things, if you were a rich person like Darwin, was breeding pigeons. Anybody ever eat a pigeon? They're pretty good, actually. There's not a lot of meat there. So usually like a mourning dove or a band-tailed pigeon, you take all the feathers off, you wrap it in bacon, you barbecue it, it's pretty tasty. Okay. Anyway, these pigeon fanciers would breed all kinds of different pigeons because it was cool. Look what kind of pigeon I have. So if you actually look right here, this is called a fantail. Okay, head's right around here. Okay. Fantail. And then you've got all these other ones. You've got these rollers. You've got these poofers. You've got all kinds, right? In fact, they even bred a pigeon with a neurological deficit. It would be flying along, and it would suddenly go crazy and start tumbling. It was called a tumbler. And then suddenly it would come back to life and go, oh, I'm tumbling, and it would come back and start flying along again. There are also pigeons, homing pigeons, bred to come back to where they were from. All those kinds of things. So Darwin was a big one in selective breeding. Okay. And then, of course, there was agricultural products. In this case, okay. That little thing there is called teosinte. Teosinte is a wild plant. It's actually the ancestor of all corn. Okay? It was domesticated in the Mexican highlands about 10,000 years ago. In other words, you can see that this thing has very, very, very small seeds. And it turns out that they selectively bred teosinte so that they would end up with larger kernels. Like in here, right? All these little larger kernels, until finally, over many generations, they would end up with a nice piece of corn with big kernels, big juicy kernels. And if you actually look at different kinds of corn that were bred over the years, you have some of different colors. The kind of corn that you like to eat is actually pretty different than the corn that we feed to cattle. It looks the same, but it doesn't taste. The stuff for cattle is kind of like mushy. Okay? But anyway, there's other things like potatoes, like wheat. All these things were bred for certain characteristics, whether the people who were doing the breeding knew it or not. Okay? So one of the things about wheat is that makes it so good is that the wild plant, when the seeds are ripe, they blow away. They're released very easily. Well, the early farmers of wheat kept, by accident, using the seeds from plants that didn't release their seeds so easily. In other words, they go along and they collect seeds from plants that had a variation where they didn't release the seeds easily. And they bred those over and over again until you had wheat that doesn't drop its seeds. Makes it much easier in terms of a food product than having to run around collecting wild seeds from wheat and things like that. Okay. Anybody, give me an example of natural selection. What do you think?
Let me say, just the way that different characteristics.
Okay. Think about, let's say, think about a predator-prey system. What's one that you can think of?
A bear and fish.
Okay, a bear and fish. Good. Exactly. There's natural selection there. The bear is a selective agent. It's trying to catch fish. Now, instead of having a selector, like a human selecting traits, we'll say that the environment that the organism is in is actually selecting. It's an unfortunate word choice there. There's no real conscious selection, nor from the individual that selection is working on, is there any conscious choice of choosing this or selecting that. It's just pretty much that we're talking about different selective environments. Okay? So, like the bear and the fish. Big brown grizzly bears, they like to eat salmon. They station themselves on a river where the salmon are coming upriver after spending 3 or 4 years in the ocean to go and breed, and then they're going to die. Some of those fish can jump higher, swim faster, and avoid getting eaten by salmon because of traits they have compared to other salmon. The ones that escape the bear will leave, they'll produce eggs and sperm and create a new little salmon fry. The ones that are caught by the bear, they're finished, right? Anything they had to contribute in the future generations is now down the throat of the bear and into the stomach, right? Now, there's the same sort of, so that's natural selection. The bear is a selective agent. However, if you've ever seen bears try to catch fish, let's say on a nature show, it's hard. There's these fish that are flying through the air, and the bears that have better bears don't have very good eyesight in general, but have better eyesight, have better reflexes, are more likely to catch fish than bears that are inept. So there's also selection by the fish to escape, well, the bears that are able to catch more fish are the ones that are going to leave their genes into future generations. In other words, the fish are putting a selective pressure. If all the fish were the same and they were inept, it wouldn't matter how good you were at catching fish. You just go in and pick a fish, and that's the end of it, right? Well, in this case, it's hard to catch a fish. The fish that can escape are putting pressure, and compared to the fish that aren't able to escape, puts pressure on the population of bears, on individuals. So individuals that are able to catch fish at a greater rate than others are the ones that leave more offspring. Now you could call this, we call this natural selection. It's just basically the environment and nature, as it were. Now, so we've got selection for, let's say, certain traits. The question is evolution by natural selection different than natural selection? And what I mean is it possible to have natural selection happen without evolution? And is it possible to have evolution without natural selection? Well, we know about the latter one because I told you about these different forces that have nothing to do with natural selection. Okay? And then you can have natural selection without evolution if a trait is not heritable, not passed down from one generation to the next. So evolution by natural selection is different than just natural selection or evolution. Evolution is a pattern, and natural selection is a process to sort those variants. So it's a specific kind of evolution. Okay, so in this case, unlike breeding and selective breeding and what we call artificial selection, natural selection, anywhere there's a difference in survival and reproduction from one generation to the next, in terms of different genotypes or different phenotypes within a population, that means that population is going to change, and more members that are that have good genes, let's say, in other words, selection has favored them, are going to leave more offspring into the future generations. And in this way, natural selection modifies. It does not modify the individual. It modifies the population. It's kind of like, anyone want to know what a sieve is? Anybody gone to Nutsberry Farm and panned for gold? Okay, good. Well, it turns out gold is heavier than other metals, so when they put some gold in there, it's heavier, it sinks to the bottom. But you can also get a thing, let's say a big thing with a bunch of holes in it, like a colander. Some colanders in the kitchen have very, very fine mesh, others much bigger, right? Depending on what you want to keep in and the rest that you want to leave out. Well, evolution is kind of like that. It's like a colander with, let's say, a certain size mesh. The individuals or particles that can get through the mesh escape. The ones that are caught don't, and we'll say that they're selected against. Okay? So it's kind of like a seed. So individuals themselves don't change. You're kind of like dealt a hand. Anybody in here play poker? Okay. It'd be great, wouldn't it? You're playing poker, and you can suddenly, let's say you're dealt a 2 of spades, a king of hearts, a jack of diamonds, just a bunch of cards. There's nothing there. Now, it would be great if you could turn them all into aces, wouldn't it? Well, we're like the initial cards. We are born with what we've got. We can't suddenly turn into a bunch of aces and be winners. So it's not like, oh, it'd be better if I could, if I had this trait. Let's say, it would be better if I could fly. Anybody in here would like to fly? Think about if you could actually fly like a bird. Wouldn't that be cool? Okay. Why can't I fly? I can now with technology, but why? Well, it turns out, I was not born, neither were you, with the traits that would have allowed me to fly. There was a time in the past when I might have taken LSD and thought I could fly, but it didn't work. Okay, so in this way, individuals who have the goods are the ones that will be successful in passing on their genes. It's not like, oh, it would be better if I could turn myself from, some scraggly-ass dog into, let's say, a prize-winning golden retriever. Doesn't work that way. You're dealt the hand that you have. Okay. Now, so populations change, individuals do not. A genotype or phenotype, a trait, that increases an individual's ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment is called an adaptation. Those individuals that don't have that are at a disadvantage, and eventually their genes are going to disappear from the gene pool. Fitness is an individual's ability to survive and reproduce and pass on his or her genes. Adaptation is any trait that increases an individual's fitness, ability to survive or reproduce, in a specific environment. So you might think that, well, maybe there are adaptations that are perfect. Good. Well, let's think about that bear and the ones with fur. Thin fur and thick fur. Okay. Okay. Let's say right now, in terms of fur thickness, we'll have something along the x-axis, along the bottom, to 100, we'll say, in terms of fur density. And then along the y-axis is the number of individuals in the population that have that. And so we go up north, we sample wolves, not bears, wolves, and we find out that this is what let's say we sample 1,000 wolves for how dense their fur is within a certain area. And we find something like this, where most of the wolves are closer to around the average, which is, let's say, we'll say 5,000, 5K per square centimeter. Okay. Now let's say that the population or the weather, the climate warms. Having such a thick fur coat is maybe not such a good idea. And we find out that all the individuals with thick fur are not as good as the ones that are now at thin fur, and so we now have a population, where it shifted down to, let's say, 2,000 strands of fur per square centimeter. Okay? What that means is that originally we thought, oh, having 5,000 hairs per square centimeter is great in certain environments, but it's not in all environments. It's only in certain environments. As the environment changes, certain traits that, or trait variants that seem to be perfect are no longer perfect. So when someone tells you something about an adaptation, it doesn't mean that that adaptation is always perfect or good and enough in a certain environment. It is in a certain environment, but not all environments. Okay. So here's some things that we can just run through. You can read them yourself. Natural selection works on individuals. In other words, the bear and the fish. Those fish that have traits that allow them to escape the bear, selection favors. Those fish that are easy to catch by the bear are disfavored, and their traits and their genes are removed from the population. So selection works on the individuals. Some individuals have traits or adaptations that allow them to survive and reproduce better than others in a certain environment. Individuals themselves do not evolve or change. It's kind of like you're dealt a hand. It's not like you can suddenly become 4 aces when your original hand stank. But populations evolve. So those are populations or a whole bunch of individuals, like you mentioned, let's say within a species, and the frequency of certain traits in that population changes depending on the environment, because under, let's say, a new environment, there are more of certain individuals with certain traits in future environments and in that population, or in future populations, than in individuals who don't have those traits. So populations evolve in terms of the frequency of certain traits or certain alleles that are responsible for those traits. So remember, in terms of the scientific method, we have this hypothesis, or theory at this point, evolution by natural selection, which is that certain traits that individuals have confer on them certain advantages or disadvantages that will then cause the populations that they were a part of to change in the frequency of those advantages and disadvantages. So we can actually go out and look. In fact, we can even do experiments. You take a whole bunch of bacteria and you put them in a certain environment, and then you change the environment, and individuals with traits that allow them to better survive in the new environment are more likely to make more bacteria. And you can actually measure that. You can also look at individuals and see how likely it is that they're going to actually reproduce. Let's say with the salmon and the bears, you can tag a whole bunch of salmon. You can get a little clip so we can do DNA on them and see what variant alleles they have. And then you can release those salmon, let's say as a little tiny fry, and then see which ones come back 4 years later and actually successfully breed compared to the ones that don't. So we can test all these things. In other words, we can falsify them. Now, I have a question. If a lion ate you, would that be natural selection? Okay. Anybody in here think that's not natural selection? Okay, why?
Isn't it genetic drift? Just
What?
Genetic drift is just by chance without you?
Well, it could be. It could be. So that's a good point. That's a very good point. It could be genetic drift, that just by chance that lion, it just, it's kind of like me and the butterfly, right? But in terms of, let's say it's because you're an idiot and you went out to pet a nice big kitty cat compared to some other individual who's more cautious. Would you consider that natural selection? Okay. In other words, the trait here is not that you're big enough and covered in, let's say, plates of armor that a lion would hurt you. It's mainly your behavior. Some individuals just go out and are stupid. There's always in Africa, on these safari trips, there's always some person that goes out there and thinks, oh, nice big kitty, and they go out and they want to pet him. They're just feeding the next generation of cats, okay? You go to Yellowstone National Park, and you see these big animals like elk and bison. Elk and bison, they don't eat meat, they eat grass, so they're nice big herbivores. And then tourists go up and try to get a nice picture or a video of them, and the animals don't like it and stomp them to death. I used to live up in Humboldt County, and I didn't live there because I was growing weed, okay? And there's a Prairie Creek State National Park, or Prairie Creek State Parks, which is part of the National Park System for Redwood National Park. And they have these elk. And now during the breeding season, the male elk are especially very, they're males, okay? The rest of the year, all they really want to do is kind of hang out maybe with the guys and eat, okay? Well, there was this German tourist. Anybody, I'm sorry if I'm picking on Germans in here. I apologize. Okay, there's this German tourist who thought, cool, elk. So there was this nice big bull elk, kind of like hanging out eating. He decides he wants to get a real good video of this elk. So he gets closer and closer. The elk moves away, gets closer, the elk moves away. Finally, the elk had enough. It said, I'm trying to be nice, and you're interrupting my breakfast. So the elk knocks him over, stands over him, and pees all over him. Okay? That's what happened. Okay. That's natural selection too. Obviously, you have an idiot who wants to get a good video. Okay, if you get the girl and I don't, is that selection? Anybody who disagrees? Or how about if you get the guy and she doesn't, is that selection, natural selection? Anybody say yes? Anybody say no? Okay, why?
I mean, it's not, do you mean natural selection? I mean, no one's really selected.
Well, but they're gonna, that's what the whole, let's say it's not humans. Let's say it's two bears. There's a whole bunch of female bears and a whole bunch of male bears. Now, I just want you to know that sex between bears is a rather violent affair. Some would say it's a little coercive in terms of the males versus the females. Okay, so if one female bear or one male bear gets this female, and the other male bear is just left standing there with nothing, would you call that selection, natural selection? Okay? Because the one who gets the female is more likely to pass on this genes, right? Is there a difference between you and a bear? Why?
I don't have
What?
I don't have birth.
That's, how does that affect in terms of whether someone wants to have, well, it could have effect on if someone wants to marry you or not. If you're hairy, perhaps they don't, or maybe someone else likes, oh, it's so cuddly. Right? Okay, so, okay, you still disagree?
No, I agree.
Okay, yeah,
I still disagree because when it comes down to it, like a lot of times it's based on like what the individual prefers over others.
exactly.
So it's a very
So
single
let's say I don't get the girl, but you do. And the girl is choosing who she wants to be with.
because of some different traits that we have.
Yeah, I'm a short little asshole, okay? And, you're not, okay? So she prefers to be with you. Is that selection? And possible evolution. Who's more likely to breed, you or me?
If she picked me, then it would be me.
Yeah, okay, so you have traits that are more likely for you to not just survive, but to reproduce. Okay, so selection, evolution by natural selection, and selection is just not about survival. It's also about what's called sexual selection and reproduction. More likely to actually breed successfully than some others. If I bop you on the head and kill you, is that natural selection? What do you think? Is that natural selection? Why? Let's say a chimpanzee picks up a big stick and destroys the cranium of another chimpanzee. Is that natural selection? Okay. What's the difference between you and a chimpanzee? Are you an animal? You're not an animal? Are you related to an animal? Okay. What traits do you have that make you, let's say, more related to certain animals than others? Okay, bipedalism, anything else? Hands? How about between you and reptiles? What do you have that reptiles don't have? Hair? Okay. What animals have hair besides reptiles, besides mammals? Are there any other ones? No. So you're more closely related to mammals. Does that still mean that you're not an animal? You think you're special and that you escaped animalness? Okay. So we're animals. Some of us are more animalistic than others, like myself. Occasionally I go, and I start chewing on things, and I just can't help myself, so I'm an animal. Whereas someone more civilized might not act like that. But even that civilized person is still an animal. Is still a living organism. Okay, so if I bop you on the head, you can be sure that's selection. Okay? And whether it kills you or not. It may be that I try to bop you on the head, but you're bigger than me. And then you take the stick from me and bop me on the head and kill me. Okay? But that's still selection. If a pine cone, you're walking in the forest, there's this tree with really big pine cones, up about 150 feet, you're walking along, and one falls and dents your cranium. Is that natural selection?
Pure chance.
Huh?
That's just pure chance.
It's chance, yeah. I'm not talking about questions about natural, I'm not talking about evolution by natural selection, I'm talking about natural selection. The pine cone falling on your head. Pine cone, it's chance, okay? You might, it's unlikely that, well, there's variation in cranium thickness. Someone might survive compared to someone else. Even though the one who didn't survive is probably luckier because the other one is left in the vegetative state. Okay, so you can have natural selection without evolution. Pine cone comes along and drops and hits your cranium. All the alleles that you have are now out of the gene pool. Okay? But it's not like there's some variation that a whole bunch of individuals have that make them less likely to die by pine cone. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection? Yes? No? Anybody?
You just said like, there's not a bunch of humans that can survive getting hit by a bus, so it's not natural selection?
Is it not natural selection or not evolution by natural selection?
Well, I was just going off based on the pine cone thing you said.
Yeah, it's chance. Now, it just so happens that we made the buses, but the bus is still gonna kill you just as much as the pine cones. So that's actually selection. It's random chance, and it's unlikely that it's going to actually affect allele frequencies in the future populations because almost anybody, no matter who they are, who is hit by a bus will die. Or even if they don't die, they'll be so wrecked that they don't ever get picked to have sex with and have a happy ever after, right? So even though a bus is not an organism or a living thing, it doesn't matter. At the same time, it's probably not going to have any effect in terms of having some individuals having traits for surviving a bus, so that, let's say, you have some individuals with some strange skin disease that makes their skin kind of stiff and kind of like armor. Now normally, that person, there are people like that, that person is unlucky, and even though, well, they're not likely to breed successfully because there's not many people who want to breed with them. But it could be that they survive buses. And because of their thick skin, eventually there's variation, and individuals with thicker skin survive better than others, and eventually you end up with like a rhinoceros with thick plates of skin that are kind of more like plates, okay? Actually, you actually could have, more likely though, it's probably behavior. People who are not really paying attention are more likely to get hit by buses, among other things. So they're less likely to actually leave offspring in the future. So which of those or the previous might, let's say, result in evolution by natural selection? Number one, if a lion eats you, would that result in perhaps evolution in human beings in terms of getting eaten by a lion or any other kind of wild animal? Yeah, I mean, it's
Ones where they're smart and you don't go out very many?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. In other words, remember, it's not just physical traits, it's also behavior. Okay? Now, in terms of the girl, it's called sexual selection, or the boy. That's also affects natural selection. Just think about the bad boy. Anybody in here who's a bad boy? Oh, good. Okay. Will you stand up? Good. Okay. You girls, any girls in here like bad boys? You do?
I was.
Oh, okay.
All right, nice try.
Okay, any girls in here like, kind of like guys that were a little, kind of, yeah, okay, let's say you do. Yeah. Or let's say you do, right? Instead of some dull guy who's going to become an accountant, you like a guy who kind of charges around a little bit. He is a bad boy. He's likely to get the girls. Now, I just want to point this out. He's also likely to die earlier than the ones who aren't bad boys. Why? Yeah, exactly. Cap death, right. You mess with his girlfriend, he's not happy, right? Okay. However, let's say you're a real bad boy and you have sex with 100 girls versus some other guy who is lucky to get one girl, right? Or the other way around, you have a girl who has sex with 100 guys looking for the right one. Anyway, in terms of you may not live past, let's say, another year because of your bad boyhood. But in the meantime, he's left 40 offspring. Who's the winner in terms of evolution? Even though he's long dead, he's leaving more offspring. Now, there's a difference between value, let's say we put value on certain kinds of behavior versus not, versus evolution, and the natural world doesn't give a damn about whether you're being a nice guy or a bad guy or anything like that. It's just a matter of the coin of the realm is leaving successful offspring. Now, as humans, we've decided that maybe not leaving 15 offspring, most of who died before adulthood, is such a good idea. We've changed our behavior, but it doesn't mean that we're evolutionarily more fit. Okay. Now, are humans still evolving, do you think?
Yes.
You, yes? No? Okay, yep. Okay. You mean we're not perfect? Okay. Anybody think humans kind of got to how they were by evolving and then they stopped evolving? Okay. Just so you know, we are still evolving. Who in here is lactose intolerant? They drink milk? Okay. Really? You're lactose? Okay. Because you actually come from probably Northern Europeans who had a pastoral society, and that's where lactose tolerance arose. Unfortunate. Okay. So it turns out that certain populations of humans have evolved lactose tolerance by keeping the gene that breaks down milk on instead of normally shutting it off like with most mammals after they leave their mommy and stop drinking milk. So that's just one example. Okay, now, for evolution by natural selection to occur, there has to be variation. Do you look like I do? Okay. Do you look like her? Does anybody in this room except for you look like anybody else in this world? I know you because you have is she an identical twin?
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like there's two of her. But in general, there's variation. Okay? In the old days, it was thought that variation was imperfection, but now we know that variation is the stuff that actually natural selection works on. So let's say we have these individuals in terms of the salmon and the bear. Some salmon are more likely to escape than other salmon. There's a whole variation in terms of how good they are at escaping. The ones that are more likely to escape, if that trait is heritable, that means you can pass it from your mama or papa down to you and then to your children, and that confers some advantage, then it's likely that that fish is going to leave more offspring. That's evolution by natural selection. So there must be variation. Anybody in here who started on Darwinian snails? Okay, good. This is what this is all about. What's the variation in Darwinian snails?
As soon as the green crabs got introduced to the population, the snail shells started to thicken for the future generations.
So but what's the variation?
Yeah, the thickness of the shells.
Thickness of the shells, exactly. So that's the variation that selection is actually acting on in the form, in this case, the green crabs. The green crabs can crush thin shells, they can't the thicker shells.
And I have
Okay.
to work more harder to crack them.
Or work much more harder, right. Okay? Now, of course, if shell thickness wasn't heritable, in other words, a periwinkle with thick shells is just as likely to leave offspring with thin shells. It doesn't matter how much variation there is. There'll still be selection, and there'll still be a change in that population's frequency, but it won't be passed on to future generations, because it's not heritable. So you need heritable variation for selection to act on. And then something in the environment permits some individuals to survive and reproduce better than something else. In this case, it's green crabs. Okay? Or in the case of salmon, the bears. Or in the case of the wolves, it's actually the climate. These are all different kinds of natural selection. And the traits that they affect are, as long as there's variation, they're not all identical, and they're heritable, then you will see change in future generations. If this whole room was full of clones, you were identical to your parents, there would still be heritability, but there'd be no variation. Okay? Now it turns out that a lot of organisms reproduce by making clones, like bacteria. The thing is, there's always some mutation actually happening. If there was no mutation, you'd never have any natural, and ever have any evolution. So, and eventually what happens is a population is transformed from a whole bunch of, let's say, variants among individuals to a population that is now composed of mostly, let's say, one kind of individual with one allele or a few alleles that make them more likely to survive and reproduce. That means that a population has now evolved because of selection from being composed of a frequency of these kinds of alleles into the next generation having these alleles that survived and the other ones have been wiped out. Okay. So this is just a little thing. Where's the variation here? Anybody? Okay. Here's a variant. Right? Everybody else, pretty much the same. Which is a selective force?
The farmer.
Mm-hmm. There. See that axe? Who's it going to be? So there's variation. It turns out there was also inheritance. This whole population of chickens in the barnyard. Most of them came from other small chickens. There was a mutant that came up, got a long neck. Better to keep your head down in that case. In this case, he couldn't. Okay, so there's now differential fitness. And these chickens are more likely to survive, come on, compared to that chicken. Okay. And then eventually the populations are transformed. They become actually, in this case, if you're all the same, then you're pretty much all have equal chance of selection. And selection might be weaker in this case. Okay. Adaptation. Now, natural selection, there was a friar, Anglican friar, like a priest, or someone like that, who looked at adaptations like this. What is this? Anybody see what that is? It's a snake. Why is it hard to see?
They adapted to the environment. It's,
Right.
It's camouflaging itself.
Exactly. So, let's say there were a whole bunch of snakes. Some were red, some were green. Some had different splotches on them. The individuals, each generation there was variation. Those that were more camouflaged in the environment survived better. That's an example of an adaptation. In the old days it was thought that, oh, this is the benevolence of God doing this. In this case it's just evolution by natural selection. It's a pit viper. Don't let it bite you. It'll make you very sick or it might kill you. By the way, venom in snakes varies a lot. Certain lineages that shared common venom now have venoms that have changed depending on what kind of prey they eat. So a lot of snake venoms can be kind of turned into like 3 different basic types. Neurotoxins that affect the nervous system. So an individual who gets bitten can't breathe, heart stops. Hemotoxin, kind that breaks down blood. Mycotoxin, that kind of breaks down muscles. Depending on, you can imagine, in these populations of snakes, some snakes eat different foods. Some of those prey items respond more strongly to a neurotoxin than, let's say, a mycotoxin. Okay, giraffes. Individuals at this point who have longer necks are more likely to survive a famine compared to individuals who have shorter necks. If we actually look at the ancestors of giraffes, we find that they had normal-sized necks. There's now something called a forest giraffe that has an extended neck but not nearly as long, called an okapi. Got these polar bears. They have adaptations not only for surviving the cold, but also so that they can't be seen. Same thing with these stick insects. One has a structure like a green leaf, so it would do very well on plants with leaves like that are green. It would be camouflage versus this other one, the brown one, would do better in environments where it was mainly brown leaves, like during the fall. So if you took, what would happen if you took the brown leaf one and put it on the green tree? What would happen? Huh? Yeah. What would happen to it, do you think? Eaten, probably eaten by something that a visual predator. Do that. Okay, read that. Okay. So, in terms of inheritance, we're going to learn more about this in more detail. So we talked about alleles, right? Different variants of a gene that correspond to different bases in DNA, A, C, T, G, okay? And the thing is, though, when he came up with his evolution by natural selection, he didn't know about what's called particulate inheritance. In other words, we inherit alleles. It's not like we inherit paint. And the paint from one person is white, and the paint from another is let's say, red, and then you end up with pink individuals. In other words, who have a trait that's kind of been washed out. So Darwinian evolution had a real problem. And he came up with all sorts of ideas to fix it, but he didn't know about particulate inheritance. It wasn't until, well, Gregor Mendel around the same time, who was an agriculturalist working on pea plants, who actually figured out particulate inheritance. Unfortunately, Mendel read Darwin's book, but didn't seem to think that his stuff had any effect on it, and Darwin was completely unaware of Mendel. Okay? So, as you can see, with particulate inheritance, let's say you have an allele that gives a blue pigment. You have another allele that gives a yellow pigment. If you have an individual with a blue and a yellow allele, and they actually end up with a pigment that's expressed as kind of green. It looks like it's kind of blending, but it's actually not. Okay, so evidence of microevolutionary change in terms of selection. Insects and mites. Everybody know what a pesticide is? Okay, it's a poison, it's a toxin. We've seen when pesticides were first used, populations of insects, eventually almost everybody in the population was resistant to that pesticide, so they have to find new ones. The same thing happened in terms of antibiotic resistance, which is something that we still have to deal with now. Most of the bugs that, or microbes, bacteria specifically that cause disease, most of them are susceptible, but there's growing resistance in some bacteria. There's some types of tuberculosis, which isn't very common in this country or in the West, that is now completely resistant to any kind of antibiotic that's available. And then one of the earliest observations and then studies on evolution in multicellular organisms, well, insects are too, but birds and moths. Okay, so that during the Industrial Revolution, they used coal to burn, to power their factories, to heat their homes, all that kind of stuff. Coal's really dirty. When you burn coal without pollution controls, it kind of soot coats everything. And so before there was coal burning and before the Industrial Revolution, there were these moths. Most of them were the white form. In fact, there wasn't even any reports of a dark form. Like this, before then. And then, as coal was released, darkened the trees, and all of a sudden what was adaptive in terms of camouflage was now maladaptive. Okay. So this is kind of what happens with antibiotic resistance. We end up with a population of bacteria. In time, there's mutations show up. In this case, most of the bacteria are still white, but there's a few mutations that are red and blue. Process of growth and division. So there's more and more mutants, as you can see. And then here's a selective event. Microbes are exposed to a toxin, antimicrobial compound that kills them. In this case, in terms of antibiotics, it's bacteria. In terms of viruses, it's antivirals, antifungals, those sorts of things. Okay. So eventually, microbes are, most of these, as you can see, these all died. Okay. Except for certain mutants that were actually resistant. It turns out the most resistant ones were the red ones. Okay, so the blues went away, all of these went away, and the only thing that were left over were these two red ones. Now, it doesn't mean that these resistant ones were perfectly resistant. It just means that when they were exposed to the antibiotic or the microbial compound, they were more likely to survive a little bit longer than others. So when you go to the doctor and the doctor prescribes an antibiotic for you, they're very specific about to make sure that you actually do the whole prescription for 10, let's say 5 days or 10 days, whatever it is. Instead of after 2 days you feel a lot better, because let's say you've got a bronchial pneumonia or something like that, and you stop taking them. It just means that there were these mutants that were somewhat at least resistant to the antibiotic. You stop taking them, they survived, they were the next generation that was then slightly resistant. There were probably then more mutations. Eventually, over time, you end up with a population that's almost completely resistant, no matter how much of the antibiotic they actually use. By the way, antibiotic resistance is really common for one reason. Bacteria actually use and manufacture their own antibiotics to fight other bacteria. Okay. Well, thanks for pointing the CC closed caption thing out to me. I'll make sure that it's always done. Okay, so what was the source of the genetic variation among individual bacteria in the population? The environment or mutation? Huh? Mutation. What was the selective force causing the frequency of the population of bacteria to evolve antibiotic resistance over time? So what was the selective force, the antibiotic or the individual bacteria? Right. How did the cause of selection change the selective environment? So in this case, remember, the antibiotic did not cause the mutations. Mutations happen randomly. The selective environment just became toxic because of the antibiotics already there. Now, this is not to say that there aren't toxins that cause mutations. They're called mutagens, and there's other compounds that cause tumors and cancer. So those are called carcinogens. Okay, so you can actually have something that, let's say, is in the environment that actually causes mutations to happen. But in this case, it's just random mutation. The force of selection was acting on an individual bacteria or the population? The force of selection, either an individual bacteria has a mutation that allows it to survive or not, or it doesn't. In other words, it was dealt a certain hand. The antibiotic has a direct force on individuals in the population, some of which survive better than others, then the population changes. So there's a difference between selection and where it's acting and then evolution in a population. The genetic makeup of an individual bacteria or a population of bacteria changed over time. Right, exactly. Okay, so in terms of industrial melanism, you can see the first mutants, in other words, dark-formed moths, they were probably being produced, but no one saw them because they were being eaten right away before the Industrial Revolution. But once things started turning black, they survived, whereas the other wild type that was there before, the white ones, are now suddenly easy to see, right? And birds come along and pick them off. And so a guy named Kettlewell in the late 50s took a bunch of moths, marked them, released them, and then later collected moths, and there was a certain number that were sampled that had marks on them. He put out equal numbers of those that are dark and light form that were marked. And he put them out in two different environments. An environment away from industrial pollution, and the other one was within. And then he counted all the ones of the moths they had marked that were still around. And it showed that, in fact, those individuals seemed to have higher fitness in terms of melanin if they were in an environment where all the tree bark was dark. He also then set up an aviary and did the same sort of thing in a more controlled environment. And then finally, pollution controls were put into place. Then coal wasn't used anymore. They were using heavy petroleum, or they were using gasoline, natural gas. And so suddenly the dark forms that were now more prevalent were suddenly becoming more rare because they got picked off by birds. As the environment started to clean up, and now there's these trees, there's very few dark trees anymore because there's no longer coal being actually burned. So what was the source of the genetic variation among individual moths? Was it the environment or mutation? Source of genetic variation. Yeah. Okay, so remember, this is the same thing I asked, these are the same questions I asked for antibiotics. Selection act on the individual moths or the population? Which color morph of the moths is the best?
Depends on the environment.
Okay. Remember, adaptations are only work in their respective environments. In this case, the color morphs, in one environment, one was favored, the other disfavored, and vice versa. In other words, there's no such thing mutant that is good in all environments, primarily because there's things called trade-offs. Okay, now, we've been talking selection, and mostly we've been talking about survival. Okay? But as you know, a lot of organisms have a life cycle. They start out as a zygote, that means two gametes coming together. There's something called purifying selection. So let's say one of the gametes has a mutation, the gamete's still alive, but it's a bad mutation. Forms a zygote with a mutation. The zygote is then, it's actually lethal to the zygote. And so the zygote may be there for a second and then it dies. And that's called viability selection. As the zygote develops, and then eventually you get an adult form that can actually breed. This is where sexual selection comes in terms of either male-male competition or female choice. Or in humans, this actually works both ways. Okay. Then there's also, as adults, you still have to survive. The number of offspring. So let's say you survive and you reproduce, but one individual, where is he? Oh, he's not here. Okay, so the bad boy. His fecundity is much higher than, let's say, the rest of the population. And then finally, there's something called gametic selection in terms of, let's say, sperm competition, which we'll get to. And then, of course, we're back to compatibility selection, which is some genomes between parents are more compatible than others. So it looks like there's a certain amount of alleles from Neanderthals that are now part of modern humans from having sex. They probably, it wasn't like a male Neanderthal came along with flowers, by the way, and then had sex. It was more different. You get the idea. Well, it turns out that the genetic backgrounds between the two, when they hybridized, were not really compatible. So you ended up with actually females that were intergressed, but the males all were lethal. And it's primarily because males are what's called a heterogametic sex. If you know anything about sex chromosomes, there's an X and a Y. Females have two X's. A male has an X and a Y. If you have a mutation on an X chromosome and you're female, there's usually something called rescue on the other X. And so even though it's a bad mutation, it's overcome by the other X chromosome. In humans and in mammals, the heterogametic sex are males, and so they don't have rescue. And so you're much more likely to see certain mutations, X-linked mutations on males than females. And it turns out that it looks like most hybrids between male Neanderthals and female modern humans were lethal to all the males. And the only thing that really was left were females. So here's selection on survival again. Same sort of thing as with the moths. Here we have myxomatosis, a virus. When British went around the world and had colonies all over the place, they often were homesick. They were homesick for, let's say, the animals that were present. One of them was the bunny. And they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had bunnies in Australia? So they brought in bunnies. In Australia, all the other mammals were actually marsupials. The bunnies reproduced like crazy. There were no natural predators. They ate all the food. All the kangaroos and stuff starved, but also all the sheep were starving as well. So what they did is they brought in what was called myxomatosis virus. And they released it. And this virus was from South America. And when a bunny from Europe that was released in Australia got the virus, they died. It was about 99% lethal. In fact, it was even higher than that. Maybe 1 out of 1,000 actually survived. So you can see what happened here. There is an introduction of a virus. The population crashed. It stayed almost undetectable. Eventually, coevolution happened. You had some bunnies that actually had a little bit of resistance to the virus. And you also had viruses that, instead of being lethal immediately, were only lethal about 30% of the time. Okay. Now, fecundity selection, like we mentioned earlier. Here's a plant with leaving tons of seeds compared to, let's see, another plant that only has a few seeds. Okay, so we'll get more to sexual selection in a little bit. There's different kinds of selection that I mentioned earlier, like with the wolves and directional selection. Then there's something called stabilizing, so we'll take a look at these. So here's our population at large. These are the phenotype. In other words, let's say fur length or something like that. You can have directional selection, where selection wipes out everything, let's say in this case to the left, and the bigger phenotypes end up surviving. So let me go each of these progressively. I'll show you. Okay. So this is the trait distribution. So normal curve. We'll say the mean is 10,000 hairs per square centimeter. It gets warmer. The climate gets warmer. Oh, not that. Where am I? Okay. The individuals with long coats don't survive and reproduce as well. Oh, Christ. Okay. And so what we have here is only those with thinner coats actually survive and reproduce as well. So all these individuals, let's say, leave fewer offspring. The next population, suddenly the mean, which was before was around 10,000 per square centimeter, it's now down to 5. That means there's been directional selection from thicker fur to thinner fur. You can also just as easily have the same sort of thing. And then the next population, is that way. This is all directional selection. In the Galapagos finches, there was a drought. The drought killed most individuals, but the ones that survived had thicker beaks, which corresponded to the only seeds that were left were very hard seeds. They were the ones who survived. All the other ones died. Beak size was heritable, as you can see over on the right here, with mid-parent versus offspring bill size. And then eventually you ended up with directional selection of thicker beaks. The population then, the weather then changed, the drought ended, and suddenly the population rebounded. Individuals with thick beaks didn't do as well as individuals with thinner beaks that were better at getting all sorts of seeds. stabilizing selection. Okay, so in this graph, along the bottom, we have birth weight in pounds. And as you can see, most women give birth to babies in 6 to 8 or 9 pound range. There are very few, the further smaller the babies are, they're usually not as viable. And so if you actually look at mortality in the red, mortality is very high when the babies are very small. So underweight babies they tend to die more often than normal weight babies. Over large babies, on the other hand, there's very strong selection about getting out of the mother. So if you have a 15-pound baby that's delivered, it's likely that the baby will die and the mother will die because the baby can't get out. Okay? So there's stabilizing selection. So here is the same sort of thing. And now, so now what we actually have is we have that's much narrower in terms of birth weight. So there was then some strong selection against big babies that were too large or too small. There's also something called disruptive selection. You can see beak size, lower mandible width, and there's certain individuals that survived, either that had smaller or larger beaks. So we draw this. We have, now there's selection on everything in the middle, and eventually you end up with what's called a bimodal distribution, where you have individuals with either large or small beaks. That's called disruptive selection. Then there's something called negative frequency dependent selection. These are salmon. There's a large male salmon. On the Kenai, there's a small little jack. You might think that the big guy, bigger is better. But little guys can hide. And if there aren't only a few little guys, but there's a lot of big guys who are duking it out after female lays eggs, the little guys can sneak in. They're called sneaker males. Fertilize the eggs, get out, while one of the other big guys chases the other one off. And then lays its sperm. And it's possible that actually being smaller, in that case, is better. But it depends on the frequency. If there's a lot of individuals of small size, there are only so many hiding places. So fitness, in other words, actually fathering offspring, really depends if there are very few jacks around, your fitness is high. The more there are, your fitness declines. And the same thing happens with the big ones. And so you actually end up with a population that varies between the different morphs. Okay. And then there's something called sexual selection, as I mentioned. That's an Irish elk, very large animal. And it's all because of gamete size that there's something called sexual selection. And we'll learn about this in just a second. Males produce lots of sperm. Females produce fewer eggs that have more resources. So males generally compete for females, but not always. There's other cases where it's the reverse. So here we have, on the left is something called female choice. The female is very specific, chooses the male that she wants to mate with, that will then father all the offspring. Come on. Okay.
You only copied watch.